Tonight, we explore a quiet mystery hidden deep within our past. A question that feels almost impossible when we first hear it. Why are we the only humans left? Not the only people, but the only species of human. Because once, this world was not ours alone. Long before cities, before farming, before history itself was written down, the earth was shared by many kinds of humans. Some stronger than us, some better adapted to the cold, some with bodies built for survival in harsh and unforgiving lands. And yet, one by one, they disappeared, until only one remained. Homo sapiens. Tonight, we travel back into that lost world. A world where humans were not alone, and try to understand the slow, quiet process that led to our survival, and their disappearance. So dim the lights, relax, and let your mind drift back to a time when the word human meant something very different than it does today. If we could step back in time, not just 10,000 years, not even 50,000, but perhaps 70,000 years into the past, the world would begin to feel both familiar and deeply unfamiliar at the same time. At first glance, much of what you would see would not surprise you. Mountains would still rise high into the sky, their peaks catching the light of the sun just as they do today. Rivers would continue to carve their way through valleys, shaping the land with slow and patience. Forests would stretch endlessly across vast regions, filled with the quiet movement of wind through leaves and the distant sounds of animals moving through the undergrowth. The earth itself would feel alive in a way that is still recognizable. And yet, something would feel different. Something subtle, but impossible to ignore. Because if you looked closely, if you truly observed the world around you, you would begin to notice that you were not alone. And more importantly, the beings you encountered would not all be like you. In this ancient world, the idea of human was not limited to a single species. Instead, multiple kinds of humans lived across the planet at the same time, each adapted to different environments, each following their own way of life. In regions we now call Europe and parts of Western Asia, one of the most well-known of these groups lived. The Neanderthals. They were not identical to modern humans, but they were close enough that, if you saw one from a distance, you might hesitate, unsure of what you were looking at. Their bodies were strong and compact, shaped by thousands of years of survival in cold climates. Their limbs were powerful, their bones thick and dense, built to endure harsh winters and physically demanding lives. Their faces were different, broader, with more pronounced features, yet still unmistakably human. They were not creatures of myth or imagination. They were people in their own way. They lived in small groups, hunted animals, used tools, and adapted to the difficult environments around them. For hundreds of thousands of years, they survived successfully across large parts of the world. But they were not alone. Far to the east, beyond the lands where Neanderthals lived, another mysterious group of humans existed. Today, we call them the Denisovans. Unlike the Neanderthals, we know very little about how they looked. There are no complete skeletons, no detailed reconstructions that can fully bring their appearance to life. Much of what we know about them comes from small fragments. A piece of bone, a tooth, and most importantly, the traces they left behind within us. Because even now, thousands of years later, they have not completely disappeared. Their presence remains hidden within human DNA. Some modern populations carry small genetic traces of Denisovans, quiet evidence that at some point in the distant past, our ancestors and theirs met, and their stories became connected. And beyond these two groups, there were others as well. Different kinds of humans living in different regions. Some adapted to forests, others to open grasslands, some to cold northern climates, others to warmer environments closer to the equator. Each group carried its own knowledge, its own survival strategies, its own understanding of the land. They hunted different animals, used different tools, lived in different ways. Yet all of them belonged to the same broader human story. For thousands upon thousands of years, The Earth was not dominated by a single human species. It was shared between multiple kinds of humans who walked the same landscapes, faced the same dangers, and relied on their own unique abilities to survive. This shared existence creates a very different picture of the past than the one we often imagine today. We tend to think of human history as a single, continuous line, a straight path leading from ancient times to the present. But the reality was far more complex. It was not one line. It was a branching tree. Multiple human species existing at the same time. Living, adapting, surviving, and sometimes encountering one another. In that ancient world, if you traveled far enough, you might meet a human who did not look exactly like you, who spoke differently, moved differently, lived differently, and yet was still, in some fundamental way, human. For a long stretch of time, this was the reality of life on Earth. Not one humanity, but many. And for reasons that would only become clear much later, that shared world would not last forever. It is easy, from our modern perspective, to imagine these other humans as primitive, as something less than us, less intelligent, less capable, less aware of the world around them. For a long time, this was the story people told themselves. Early discoveries of ancient human remains were often interpreted through this lens, that these beings were crude, almost animal-like, existing far below the level of modern humanity. But as time passed, and as evidence slowly accumulated, that simple picture began to fade. Because the truth is far more complex, and far more interesting. Take the Neanderthals, for example. For many years, they were misunderstood. Their strong bones and heavy features led some to believe they were slow, unintelligent, or incapable of sophisticated thought. But modern research has revealed a very different reality. Neanderthals were highly skilled hunters. They lived in harsh and often unforgiving environments, where survival required not only strength, but strategy. Hunting large animals was dangerous and demanded coordination, planning, and an understanding of animal behavior. This was not something that could be done through instinct alone. It required intelligence. They crafted tools from stone, carefully shaping them for specific purposes. These tools were not random or crude. They showed signs of planning and design, suggesting that Neanderthals understood how to improve their chances of survival through innovation. They also controlled fire. This was no small achievement. Fire provided warmth in cold climates, protection from predators, and the ability to cook food. Maintaining fire required attention and care, as well as an understanding of how to keep it alive over time. It was a skill and a responsibility. But perhaps even more revealing is how they treated one another. There is evidence that Neanderthals cared for injured members of their group. Some skeletons show signs of individuals who lived for years with serious injuries that would have made survival alone nearly impossible. This suggests something important. They did not simply abandon those who could not keep up. They helped them. They stayed together. This kind of behavior points to social bonds, to cooperation, and possibly even to compassion. There is also evidence, though still debated, that Neanderthals buried their dead. If this is true, it raises deeper questions. Burial is not just a practical act. It can reflect something more. A recognition of death. A sense that the individual mattered. Perhaps even the beginnings of ritual or symbolic thought. While we cannot know exactly what they believed or how they understood the world, these actions suggest that their inner lives may have been more complex than we once imagined. They understood their environment in ways that allowed them to survive for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew where to find food, how to track animals, when to move, where to seek shelter. Their knowledge was not written down, but it was passed from one generation to the next through experience, observation, and teaching. In many ways, they understood their world just as we understand ours. And when we look closer, the differences between them and us begin to feel smaller. Because beneath the physical differences, the shape of the skull, the structure of the body, There may have been something deeply familiar. They likely felt fear in the presence of danger, hunger when food was scarce, relief when they were safe. They may have experienced loss when a member of their group died. And perhaps, in their own way, they experienced something like connection or belonging. We cannot fully know what it felt like to be them, but the evidence suggests that they were not empty or unaware. They were thinking beings, feeling beings, living lives shaped by both the challenges of their environment and the relationships within their groups. This realization changes how we see them. Instead of viewing them as something distant or inferior, we begin to see them as part of a shared story. Different, yes, but not entirely separate. If you were to meet a Neanderthal in the right moment, not in a moment of fear or conflict, but perhaps in a quiet moment, you might not see a monster. You might not see something strange or frightening. You might see someone sitting by a fire, watching the flames, listening to the sounds of the night, a figure shaped by a different path of human evolution, but still in many ways, recognizably human. And in that moment, the distance between us and them might feel much smaller than we once believed. Not a divide between human and non-human, but a subtle difference between one kind of human and another. So if these other humans were strong, if they were skilled, if they survived for hundreds of thousands of years in some of the harshest environments on Earth, then a quiet and important question begins to emerge. Why did they disappear? Why did only Homo sapiens remain? At first, it may seem like there should be a clear answer. A single event, a dramatic turning point, perhaps a great conflict, where one group defeated the others and claimed the world as its own. But the reality appears to be far more subtle than that. There is no evidence of one decisive battle that determined the fate of humanity. No single moment where everything changed at once. So, what we see when we look carefully at the past is something slower, a gradual process, a quiet unfolding of events over thousands of years, a combination of small differences, small advantages, that over time began to matter more and more. And eventually, those small advantages became decisive. One of the most important of these differences may have been something that is not immediately visible. Not strength, not speed, not even physical survival skills, but something deeper, the way we think. Early humans developed a unique ability that set them apart from other human species. It was not simply the ability to survive as individuals, but the ability to work together in larger, more connected groups, to cooperate beyond the limits of immediate family or small tribes. This shift may seem subtle at first, but its impact was enormous. Early Homo sapiens began to form wider social networks. Groups were no longer isolated units living and dying within their own small territories. Instead, they became connected. Information could travel. Ideas could move from one group to another, carried by individuals who interacted, shared, and learned from each other. This created something powerful, a kind of collective knowledge. If one group discovered a more effective hunting strategy, that knowledge did not remain limited to them alone. Over time, it could spread. If another group learned how to create a better tool, that idea could travel as well. A sharper blade, a more efficient spear, a safer way to store food. Each improvement, no matter how small, added to a growing body of shared understanding. And this understanding was not fixed. It was constantly evolving, constantly improving. This meant that humans were no longer relying only on individual experience or isolated learning. They were building something much larger, a network of ideas, a shared intelligence that extended across groups and generations. Other human species, such as the Neanderthals, may also have had forms of communication and cooperation, but their networks appear to have been smaller, more localized. Their knowledge may have remained within limited groups, without spreading as widely or as quickly. In contrast, Homo sapiens began to connect in ways that allowed innovation to accelerate. One idea led to another. One improvement made the next possible. Progress, though still slow by modern standards, became continuous. And over long periods of time, this made a difference. Imagine two groups living in similar environments. Both skilled, both capable of survival. But one group improves its tools slightly faster, shares knowledge more widely, adapts more quickly when conditions change. At first, the difference might seem insignificant, barely noticeable, but over hundreds, and then thousands of years, that difference grows. It compounds, until one group begins to outpace the other. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily. This is the nature of subtle advantage. It does not announce itself. It does not create a single moment of victory. Instead, it works quietly, accumulating over time. And as ideas continued to move, as knowledge continued to spread, humans became more adaptable, more flexible, more capable of responding to challenges. A new hunting method could mean more reliable food. A better shelter design could improve survival during harsh weather. A shared warning about danger could protect entire groups. Each small advantage increased the chances of survival. And survival over time shapes everything. So when we ask why only Homo sapiens remain, the answer may not lie in one dramatic event, but in thousands of small moments. Moments of learning, of sharing, of adapting. Moments where one group found a slightly better way and passed it on, until those small differences became something larger, something powerful enough to shape the future, not through force alone, but through connection, through cooperation, through the quiet strength of a species that learned, not just how to survive, but how to grow together. Language may have played a crucial role in the long story of human survival. Not just simple communication, not just sounds used to signal danger or to call others nearby, but something far more advanced, something more flexible, more expressive, more powerful, complex language, the kind of language that allows ideas to move beyond the present moment, the kind that allows one mind to reach into another, to share not only what is happening now, but what has already happened, and what might happen in the future. This ability may seem natural to us today, so familiar that we rarely stop to think about it. But in the ancient world, it may have been one of the most important differences between Homo sapiens and other human species. Because complex language does something extraordinary. It allows humans to describe things that are not immediately visible. A person can speak of a distant river, even if it lies far beyond the horizon. They can warn others of a dangerous animal, even if it is not present at that moment. They can describe a place where food is abundant, or where shelter can be found during a storm. This means that knowledge is no longer limited to direct experience. It can be shared, passed from one person to another, from one generation to the next, and not just in simple forms, but in detail, in nuance, in ways that preserve meaning across time. Language also allows humans to talk about the past, to remember events, to reflect on what worked and what did not. A failed hunt can become a lesson. A dangerous mistake can become a warning. A successful strategy can become a model to repeat. Through language, experiences are no longer lost. They become part of a growing memory. A collective understanding that belongs not just to individuals, but to the group. And perhaps even more importantly, language allows humans to imagine the future, to think ahead, to plan, to ask questions that begin with what if? What if the animals move this way next season? What if the weather changes suddenly? What if we build shelter in a different place? This ability to imagine possibilities allows for preparation. And preparation increases the chances of survival. Groups that can plan ahead are not simply reacting to the world. They are anticipating it, in nuance, in ways that preserve meaning across time. Language also allows humans to talk about the past, to remember events, to reflect on what worked and what did not. A failed hunt can become a lesson. A dangerous mistake can become a warning. A successful strategy can become a model to repeat. Through language, experiences are no longer lost. They become part of a growing memory, a collective understanding that belongs not just to individuals, but to the group. And perhaps even more importantly, language allows humans to imagine the future, to think ahead, to plan, to ask questions that begin with "what if?" What if the animals move this way next season? What if the weather changes suddenly? What if we build shelter in a different place? This ability to imagine possibilities allows for preparation, and preparation increases the chances of survival. Groups that can plan ahead are not simply reacting to the world. They are anticipating it. The planet itself was not standing still. It was changing, slowly at times, and at other moments, more dramatically. The period we now call the last ice age brought with it powerful shifts in climate that reshaped the world in ways that would have deeply affected every living creature. Temperatures across large parts of the Earth began to drop. Cold spread across northern regions. Glaciers expanded, covering vast landscapes in thick layers of ice. Entire environments were transformed. Places that were once covered in forests began to change. In some regions, trees disappeared as colder and drier conditions took hold. Open grasslands expanded where dense forests had once stood. In other areas, the opposite occurred. Shifting rainfall patterns allowed new plant life to grow, slowly changing the balance of ecosystems. The land itself was in motion, not in a sudden or violent way, but in a steady, ongoing process that unfolded over thousands of years. Rivers changed their paths. Lakes appeared and disappeared. Habitats shifted. And with these changes came a ripple effect that touched every form of life. Animals, in particular, were forced to adapt. Many species began to migrate, following the movement of vegetation and water sources. Large herds that once grazed in one region might slowly move to another, searching for better conditions. Predators followed them. And in turn, human groups that depended on these animals for survival were often forced to follow as well. But migration was not always enough. In some cases, environments changed too quickly or too severely. Food sources became scarce. Water became harder to find. Shelter became less reliable. Survival became more difficult. And in such a world, the ability to adapt was no longer just an advantage. It became essential. Some human species were highly specialized. Over long periods of time, they had become perfectly suited to the environments in which they lived. Their bodies, behaviors, and survival strategies were finely tuned to specific conditions. For example, groups living in colder climates developed strong, compact bodies that helped conserve heat. They knew how to hunt the animals of their region. They understood the rhythms of their environment. They were, in many ways, perfectly adapted. But there is a quiet risk in being perfectly adapted to a single environment. Because when that environment changes, that perfection can become a limitation. If a species is too specialized, it may struggle when conditions shift. A hunting strategy that worked in one type of landscape may fail in another. A body adapted to cold may not function as well in warmer climates. Knowledge tied to one environment may not transfer easily to a new one. And during the Ice Age, change was constant. Environments did not remain stable for long. What worked for one generation might not work for the next. In contrast, Homo sapiens appear to have developed a different kind of strength. Not specialization, but flexibility. Humans were adaptable, capable of surviving in a wide range of conditions. From cold northern regions where survival required warmth and careful resource management, to warmer tropical environments where entirely different challenges existed. This adaptability did not come from physical traits alone. It came from behavior, from learning, from the ability to change strategies when circumstances demanded it. Humans could adjust their diets, alter their tools, change their movement patterns. If one source of food disappeared, they could search for another. If one region became uninhabitable, they could move on. This willingness, or perhaps necessity, to adapt allowed humans to spread across diverse environments. They were not tied to a single type of landscape. They were not limited to one way of living. Instead, they carried their knowledge with them. And as they encountered new challenges, they added to it. This created a kind of resilience, a capacity to endure not just in one set of conditions, but across many. So when climates shifted, when forests vanished or grasslands expanded, when animals migrated or disappeared, humans were often able to respond. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but effectively enough to survive. And over time, that ability made a difference. Because survival is not always about being the strongest or the most specialized. It is about being the most adaptable, the most willing to change, the most capable of adjusting to a world that refuses to stay the same. And during the long, uncertain years of the Ice Age, as the Earth itself continued to transform, that flexibility may have been one of the most important qualities of all. It allowed humans not just to exist, but to endure. And so almost silently, the world began to change in a way that no single generation would have fully noticed. There was no sudden moment when the skies darkened or the land fell quiet. No single day when one kind of human vanished from the earth. Instead, the change unfolded gradually, over thousands of years, so slowly that it would have felt almost invisible to those living through it. Other human species began to disappear. Not all at once, not everywhere at the same time, but in different regions at different moments. Their presence began to fade. In Europe, the Neanderthals, who had lived and survived across vast territories for hundreds of thousands of years, slowly vanished from the landscape. The caves they once occupied grew empty. The paths they once walked were no longer followed. Their tools, their fires, their lives became part of the past. Further east, the Denisovans also faded into history. Unlike the Neanderthals, they left behind fewer visible traces. No large number of skeletons. No clear record of their daily lives. And yet, we know they existed. We know they lived, adapted, and survived in their own way. And then, over time, they too were gone. In other parts of the world, there may have been additional human groups. Different populations with their own unique characteristics, their own ways of living. Many of them disappeared without leaving clear evidence behind. No written records. No lasting structures. Only fragments. Hints buried deep in the ground. Or traces hidden within the genetic code of modern humans. The reasons for this quiet disappearance are not simple. There is no single explanation that fully accounts for what happened. Instead, it is likely that many factors came together. Some human species may have struggled to survive as the climate changed. As temperatures shifted and environments transformed, the conditions they had adapted to began to disappear. Food sources became less reliable. Habitats changed. The knowledge that once ensured survival became less effective in a new and unfamiliar world. Others may have faced increasing competition. As Homo sapiens expanded into new territories, different human species began to share the same landscapes. They hunted similar animals, searched for the same plants, relied on the same resources. In such situations, even small advantages could make a difference. If one group adapted more quickly, if one group cooperated more effectively, if one group shared knowledge more widely, those small differences could slowly shift the balance. Not in a single dramatic conflict, but in countless small interactions over time. And then there is another possibility, a quieter one. Some of these human species may not have disappeared entirely, but instead became part of us. There is strong evidence that early humans and Neanderthals met. And not only met, but mixed. They formed connections. They had children. And those children carried genetic material from both groups. Even today, many humans carry small traces of Neanderthal DNA within them. A few percentages hidden within the vast complexity of the human genome. A silent record of encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago. The same is true in some populations for Denisovans. Their genetic legacy lives on in subtle ways, influencing traits that we may not even fully understand. This means that these ancient humans did not simply vanish without a trace. Part of them remains, not as separate species walking the earth, but as fragments within us, carried forward through countless generations. A quiet continuation of their story. And yet, despite this blending, their identities as distinct human species came to an end. The Neanderthals are no longer a separate presence in the world. The Denisovans no longer exist as their own people. Other human groups, whose names we may never know, have also faded into silence. What remains is a single human species, Homo sapiens, the last survivors of a once diverse human family. This disappearance was not loud, not sudden, not marked by a single event that history could record. It was a gradual fading, a slow narrowing of diversity, until only one branch remained. And today, as we look back, it is easy to overlook this lost world, to imagine that humanity was always alone. But that is not the case. For most of our history, we shared this planet with others who were, in their own ways, human. Their disappearance is a quiet chapter in our story, not defined by destruction alone, but by change, by adaptation, by merging, and by time. And though they are no longer here as they once were, they have not been completely erased. They remain in fragments, in traces, in the invisible threads of DNA that connect us to a much larger past. A past where humanity was not one, but many. By around 40,000 years ago, a quiet turning point had been reached, not marked by a single event, not recorded in any written history, but visible, in hindsight, through the traces left behind. Only one human species remained, Homo sapiens, alone. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, the Earth was no longer shared between different kinds of humans. The long, complex story of multiple human species, living, adapting, surviving alongside one another, had come to an end. What remained was a single branch, the last survivors of a once diverse human family. This moment, though difficult to observe in real time, represents one of the most significant transitions in human history. Because from this point forward, every human who would ever live would belong to the same species. And yet, survival does not always mean what we assume it does. It is easy to look at the present and imagine that survival implies superiority. That Homo sapiens must have been stronger, smarter, better in every possible way. But the reality is more subtle than that. Survival does not require perfection. It does not demand that one species be the absolute best at everything. Instead, it often depends on something simpler, something quieter, adaptation, the ability to adjust when conditions change, to respond when the environment shifts, to find new ways of surviving when old methods no longer work. In a world that was constantly changing, shaped by shifting climates, migrating animals, and evolving landscapes, this ability became essential. Flexibility played a key role. Unlike species that became highly specialized for one particular environment, humans remained open to change. They were not limited to a single way of life. They could alter their behaviors, modify their tools, shift their strategies depending on where they found themselves. If one food source disappeared, they searched for another. If one region became uninhabitable, they moved. If one method failed, they adapted. This flexibility allowed humans to spread across diverse environments. From cold northern regions to warmer southern landscapes. From forests to grasslands. From coastal areas to inland territories. Wherever they went, they adjusted. And with each adjustment, they increased their chances of survival. But adaptation alone was not enough. Another key element shaped their success: cooperation. Humans did not survive as isolated individuals. They survived as groups, as communities, as networks of people who relied on one another. They shared food, shared knowledge, shared responsibility. This cooperation allowed them to overcome challenges that would have been impossible alone. A hunt required coordination. A harsh winter required collective effort. The care of children, the protection of the group, the sharing of resources, all depended on working together. And as human groups became more connected, this cooperation expanded. Information traveled. Ideas spread. One group's discovery could benefit many others. This created a powerful advantage. Not because any one individual was stronger, but because the group as a whole became more capable. And then there was one final element. The ability to change, faster than the world around them. The Ice Age brought constant shifts in climate and environment. Landscapes transformed. Animals migrated. Resources became unpredictable. In such a world, survival favored those who could respond quickly, those who could learn from experience, those who could adjust before it was too late. Humans developed this ability through communication, through shared knowledge, through collective learning. They became a species that did not simply react to change, but anticipated it, adapted to it, moved with it. Over time, this made a difference, not in a single dramatic moment, but across countless generations. Small advantages accumulated, small improvements added up, until eventually Homo sapiens stood alone. Not because they were perfect, not because they were unstoppable, but because they were adaptable, flexible, cooperative, and capable of learning faster than the challenges they faced. This is what it meant to be the last human standing. Not the strongest in every sense, but the most responsive to a changing world, the most able to adjust, the most willing to evolve their way of life. And as a result, they endured, carrying forward the story of humanity into a future where, for the first time, there was only one kind of human left to tell it. Tonight, as we rest, as the noise of the day slowly fades and the world grows quiet, it is worth remembering a chapter of our past that is so easily forgotten. A chapter that stretches far beyond written history, beyond cities, beyond kingdoms, beyond everything we usually think of as human civilization. A time when we were not alone, because for most of our existence, we were not the only humans on this earth. We were once just one branch on a much larger and more complex tree. A tree with many branches, each representing a different kind of human, each living their own lives, following their own paths, surviving in their own ways. Other humans walked this earth. They moved across landscapes that, in many ways, still exist today. They hunted animals beneath the same wide skies. They followed rivers, crossed valleys, climbed hills and mountains. They gathered around fires as night fell, just as we imagine our own ancestors did. And when they looked up, they saw the same stars, the same distant lights scattered across the darkness. Unchanged, silent witnesses to a world that has long since disappeared. It is easy to think of them as distant, as something separate from us. But in many ways, they were not so different. They lived, they struggled, they adapted, they experienced the same basic realities of life: hunger, danger, survival, connection. Their story did not end suddenly. There was no single moment when they were all gone. No clear dividing line between their time and ours. Their presence faded, slowly, quietly, over thousands of years, like footprints gradually erased by wind. At first, the differences may have gone unnoticed. A group that no longer returned, a region that grew silent, fewer signs of familiar activity. And then, over generations, the absence became more complete, until eventually, only one kind of human remained. And yet, even though they are gone as separate peoples, it is possible that they are not entirely lost. not completely erased from the story, because in subtle, quiet ways, they may still be with us, not as living communities, not as distinct species walking beside us, but as traces, fragments carried forward through time, within our DNA. Hidden in the complex patterns of our genetic code are small pieces of their legacy, remnants of encounters that took place tens of thousands of years ago, moments when different human groups met, interact, and in some cases became part of one another's story. These genetic traces are not visible. We cannot feel them. We do not notice them in our daily lives. And yet they are there, a quiet connection to a much larger past. A reminder that the story of humanity is not as simple as it might seem. It is not a straight line leading from the past to the present. It is a woven path, a merging of different histories, different lives, different kinds of humans whose journeys eventually came together. And beyond DNA, there is something else, something less measurable but equally important. Their place in our shared history. The long journey that shaped who we are today was not traveled by Homo sapiens alone. It was influenced by the presence of others, by the environments they shared, by the challenges they all faced, by the interactions, both direct and indirect, that unfolded over countless generations. Even in their absence, they remain part of the story, a story that continues through us. So as the night grows deeper, and the world around you becomes still, it is possible to imagine that ancient time, to picture a world that feels both familiar and distant. A world where humanity was not a single identity, but a collection of many, different faces, different forms, different ways of living, all existing together under the same sky. And as your thoughts drift through that distant past, there is a quiet realization that what we are today is the result of that long and complex journey. A journey shaped not only by survival, but by change, by adaptation, by connection, and by time. And in the end, only one branch continued forward, carrying within it echoes of all the others, into a future where, for the first time, humanity became one.